When the timer buzzed, both Elise and Derek set down their pens. The judges examined their answers, the room holding its breath as they deliberated. After what felt like an eternity, the head judge stepped forward, his expression unreadable. The winner of this year's regional math competition is... He paused, looking around the room. Middleton High School. The room erupted into cheers as Elise's teammates surrounded her, their excitement breaking through the tension. Elise sat frozen for a moment, unable to believe what had just happened. She had done it. She had proved herself, not just to Mrs. Grayson, not just to her classmates, but to herself. Derek scowled, his confidence shattered, and stormed off without a word. Mrs. Grayson, meanwhile, stood at the edge of the chaos, her eyes glistening with pride. She approached Elise, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You earned this," she said softly, her voice carrying an unfamiliar warmth. "And don't let anyone ever make you feel like you don't belong." Elise looked up at her teacher, a small smile breaking across her face. For the first time, she felt seen, not as the quiet girl in the back of the room, but as someone with value, with potential. The weeks that followed were different. Elise's classmates treated her with a newfound respect, and even Mrs. Grayson seemed to soften, her once unyielding demeanor giving way to moments of genuine care. Elise continued to thrive, not just in math, but in ways she hadn't imagined possible. One day after class, Mrs. Grayson handed Elise a small envelope. "I thought you might want to see this," she said. Inside was a letter of recommendation for a prestigious summer program in mathematics. Elise looked up, her eyes wide. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Mrs. Grayson replied with a rare smile. Elise nodded, holding the letter close to her chest. She didn't know where the road ahead would lead, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. The quiet girl who had once been invisible had found her voice. And in doing so, she had not only changed her own life, but also reminded Mrs. Grayson of the power of believing in someone, especially when they didn't believe in themselves. It wasn't just a lesson in math. It was a lesson in strength, resilience, and the surprising ways people can change each other for the better. Still, not everything was smooth. At the upcoming regional math competition, Elise would face not only her toughest problems yet, but also a rival school whose team included a particularly arrogant student named Derek, a math prodigy who thrived on humiliating his opponents. Mrs. Grayson warned Elise about him, but Elise wasn't concerned about Derek. What worried her was whether she could prove, once and for all, that she belonged not just to Mrs. Grayson, not just to the math team, but to herself. The day of the competition loomed closer, and the tension between Mrs. Grayson and Elise continued to grow. Mrs. Grayson pushed harder, demanding more, while Elise started to question whether she could meet her teacher's impossible expectations. But beneath the surface, both of them were beginning to understand that this competition wasn't just about math. It was about facing their own fears, their own doubts. And neither of them was ready to admit just how much they needed each other to succeed. The stage was set, the stakes were high, and as the day of the competition approached, both Elise and Mrs. Grayson knew they were headed for a moment that would change everything. The day of the regional math competition arrived, and the energy in the auditorium was electric. Teams from schools all over the district gathered, each buzzing with excitement and nervous anticipation. Elise sat quietly at the edge of her team's table, running her fingers over the edge of her name tag as she tried to calm the storm brewing inside her. Mrs. Grayson stood nearby, her sharp eyes scanning the room, her usual confidence masking the flicker of concern she felt for Elise. Derek, the star of the rival team, strolled in like he owned the place. His loud laugh and cocky demeanor turned heads as he high-fived his teammates. He caught sight of Elise and smirked, sauntering over with an air of arrogance. "So you're the quiet genius everyone's talking about," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let's see if you live up to the hype." Elise didn't respond, choosing instead to focus on the clipboard in front of her. But Derek's words lingered, poking at her insecurities. Mrs. Grayson noticed and stepped in, her voice firm and steady. "Save the theatrics for the competition, direct. Let's see if *U* can live up to the hype." The first round began, and the questions were challenging, testing not only math skills, but also speed and strategy. Elise started slow, her nerves making her hesitate on the first problem. Mrs. Grayson watched from the sidelines, her hands clasped tightly together. She knew Elise could do this, but the weight of the moment seemed to press down on the girl like a heavy blanket. Then something shifted. Elise took a deep breath and focused on the numbers in front of her, blocking out the noise and the pressure. The equations weren't just problems. They were puzzles waiting to be solved, and solving puzzles was what she loved. With each correct answer, her confidence grew, and by the end of the first round, she had pulled her team into the lead. The next rounds grew progressively harder, and tension filled the room. Turek, true to his reputation, was fast and sharp, but his overconfidence began to show. He rushed through problems, missing crucial details. Elise, on the other hand, worked methodically, her quiet determination shining brighter with each passing moment. By the final round, it was a head-to-head battle between Elise and Derek. The auditorium was silent as the moderator announced the final question, a complex, multi-step equation that left even the judges whispering among themselves. Elise stared at the board, her mind racing. She could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of her entire team resting on her shoulders. Derek, sitting a few feet away, smirked and began scribbling furiously, clearly confident he had the answer. But Elise didn't rush. She closed her eyes for a moment, picturing the problem in her mind, breaking it down into smaller pieces. The solution came to her like a wave, and her hands moved swiftly, writing out each step with precision. The silence in the classroom was unbearable. Elise stood there, still clutching the chalk in her trembling hand, her eyes scanning the room nervously. Her classmates, who moments earlier had been whispering and snickering, now exchanged stunned glances. Even the usual troublemakers in the back row didn't dare make a sound. Mrs. Grayson's expression shifted slowly, her sharp features tightening into something Elise couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger, more like disbelief, mixed with a tinge of embarrassment. The teacher took a step closer to the board, squinting at the solution as if searching for a mistake. But there wasn't one. Every number, every calculation, every tiny step of the process was flawless. "Sit down," Mrs. Grayson said finally, her voice unusually quiet. Elise nodded and returned to her seat, the knot in her chest loosening just slightly. She could still feel the weight of everyone's stares, but this time there was no laughter, no mockery. For the rest of the class, Mrs. Grayson carried on as if nothing had happened, her tone brisk and authoritative. But she avoided looking at Elise. It was as though acknowledging what had just happened would somehow unravel her carefully maintained control. After the bell rang and the students spilled out into the hallway, Elise grabbed her bag and tried to slip out unnoticed. She didn't want to be cornered by her classmates, didn't want to deal with the questions or the sudden attention. But just as she reached the door, she heard Mrs. Grayson's voice behind her. "Miss Hart, a word, please." Elise froze. Slowly, she turned around to face her teacher, who was now standing by her desk, arms crossed. "Yes, ma'am?" Elise asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Grayson studied her for a moment, her sharp eyes narrowing. "That solution," she said, nodding toward the board. "Did you come up with that on your own?" "Yes," Elise replied, her voice steady. Mrs. Grayson's lips pressed into a thin line. I see. Well, it seems I've underestimated you. Don't let it go to your head. Elise wasn't sure how to respond, so she simply nodded and left the room, her heart still racing. Over the next few days, word spread quickly. The quiet girl who never spoke in class had left Mrs. Grayson speechless. Some students were impressed, others skeptical, but the whispers followed Elise wherever she went. She didn't like the attention, but there was no escaping it. Mrs. Grayson, meanwhile, couldn't seem to shake the incident. She began assigning more challenging problems in class, often directing them specifically at Elise. At first, it felt like a punishment, a way of testing her, of putting her back in her place. But every time, Elise rose to the challenge, solving the problems with a quiet confidence that made Mrs. Grayson's frustration grow. What Mrs. Grayson didn't know, what no one knew, was that Elise spent her evenings studying in advanced math textbooks she had borrowed from the library. Numbers were her escape, her way of making sense of a chaotic world. Her home life wasn't easy. Her father worked long hours at a factory, and her mother was often too sick to leave the house. Elise had learned to be self-reliant, to find joy in the things she could control. One afternoon, Mrs. Grayson called Elise to her desk after class. "I want you to join the math team," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Elise hesitated. "I'm not sure." "You're more than capable," Mrs. Grayson interrupted. "You'll be a valuable asset. And it's time you started pushing yourself." Elise wanted to protest, but something in Mrs. Grayson's expression stopped her. It wasn't the usual sternness. There was something almost hopeful in her eyes. Reluctantly, Elise agreed. As the weeks passed, Elise found herself spending more time in Mrs. Grayson's classroom after school, preparing for competitions. At first, their interactions were formal and strained. But gradually, something shifted. Mrs. Grayson began to see past Elise's quiet exterior, and Elise started to notice the cracks in Mrs. Grayson's tough facade. It turned out Mrs. Grayson's reputation for being strict wasn't just about maintaining discipline. It was about hiding her own insecurities. She had spent her entire career proving herself in a male-dominated field, and her tough exterior was a shield she had built to survive. But as much as Mrs. Grayson pushed Elise, she also began to learn from her. Elise's quiet determination, her ability to think outside the box, and her kindness toward her classmates started to challenge the way Mrs. Grayson approached teaching. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Middleton High School, casting long streaks of light across the shiny, freshly polished floors. Students shuffled down the hallways in their usual cliques, their laughter and chatter echoing faintly as they moved toward their classrooms. In room 203, however, the atmosphere was already tense. Mrs. Grayson, the school's notoriously strict math teacher, stood at the front of the room, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Mrs. Grayson was feared by nearly everyone at Middleton. With her sharp, no-nonsense tone and unrelenting standards, she had a reputation for making even the most confident students feel small. Her tall frame and piercing gaze commanded silence the moment she stepped into any room. "Excellence is the only acceptable standard," she often repeated, her words biting as they rang out in her unmistakable voice. In the corner of the classroom sat Elise. Quiet, unassuming, and perpetually overlooked, Elise was the kind of student no one really paid attention to. She was small for her age, with thick glasses that always slid down her nose and a preference for fading into the background. Other students rarely noticed her, and even when they did, it was only to tease her for her shyness or the outdated clothes she wore. But Elise had a secret. While she sat silently at her desk, scribbling in her notebook or staring out the window, she was solving problems that would stump even the brightest adults. Numbers, patterns, and puzzles fascinated her in a way that few people could understand. It wasn't something she flaunted. She didn't want the attention. But it was there, an extraordinary gift, hidden beneath her reserved demeanor. Mrs. Grayson had no patience for students like Elise. She preferred students who spoke up, who asserted themselves, who performed well under pressure. Elise's quiet nature annoyed her, and the fact that Elise never volunteered answers only reinforced Mrs. Grayson's belief that she was just another unmotivated, mediocre student. "Miss Hart," Mrs. Grayson said one day, her tone dripping with disdain as she glanced in Elise's direction. "Since you seem to have so much free time to daydream, why don't you come up here and solve this equation for the class?" The entire room went silent. Elise's heart pounded in her chest as she slowly stood up. She could feel every set of eyes on her, the heat rising in her face. Mrs. Grayson tapped the chalk impatiently against the board, the hint of a smirk on her lips. Elise hesitated as she approached the board, the complicated equation glaring back at her like a challenge she wasn't sure she could accept. Mrs. Grayson's tone softened just slightly, but it was laced with mockery. "Take your time," she said. "We wouldn't want you to get confused." The class chuckled under their breath, and Elise's grip tightened on the chalk. She stared at the equation, her mind racing. And then, in a moment that would later become the turning point of her life, Elise made a choice. Instead of retreating into herself like she always had, she decided to prove everyone wrong. Mrs. Grayson, the class, and anyone else who had ever underestimated her. Her hand moved quickly across the board, the numbers and variables forming patterns that only she could see. Mrs. Grayson's smirk began to fade as she realized Elise wasn't just scribbling random guesses. The room grew quieter, the air thick with anticipation. When Elise finally stepped back, the answer was there, clean and precise. The room was silent. Mrs. Grayson stared at the board, her mouth slightly open, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. The quiet girl she had written off as lazy or unremarkable had just solved an equation that would have given even the advanced students pause. Elise turned around, her eyes locking with Mrs. Grayson's. For the first time, she didn't look away. And in that moment, Mrs. Grayson realized she had made a terrible mistake. But this was only the beginning. What came next would challenge everything Mrs. Grayson thought she knew. Not just about Elise, but about herself.